Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to talk about the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, which was conducted by Ancel Keys and his colleagues in the 1940s. Now if you enjoyed the video, please hit the subscribe button below. We live in a world today that is super saturated with food. Eating every couple of hours is the norm for most folks. No wonder there are more people dying from food-triggered diseases, such as type 2 diabetes, obesity, and other diseases of the metabolic syndrome, than of starvation. Food saturation became a reality only in the past few decades. In fact, one of the checkpoints of food scarcity, if I may, of the 20th century is represented by the years during and immediate to World War II. During the 1940s, Ancel Keys, who was a scientist with degrees in economics, political science, and zoology, started conducting experiments in human physiology. He was studying semi-starvation to gain insight into the physical and psychological effects of starvation and the problem of refeeding civilians who had been starved during the war. It was for a good cause from what I see. Ancel Keys and his colleagues wanted to determine efficient strategies for the victims of famine of World War II. Their studies and experiments ended in two voluminous books of 1,400 pages. Most folks know Ancel Keys as the villain who misguided the whole world through his 7-country study, where he examined the diets of 22 countries for a better insight on the link between cholesterol intake and cardiovascular disease. So far so good. But the events followed a wrong way when Keys published the data only from 7 countries and not the 22. This data that would prove a linear and apparently causal relationship between cholesterol intake and cardiovascular disease, meaning that higher cholesterol intake would lead to more chances of developing cardiovascular disease. When other researchers wanted to see if the data Keys presented was legit, they accessed the same databases, and when they introduced the data from all the 22 countries, their findings were different from Keys's. They found no relationship between cholesterol intake and cardiovascular disease, but the harm was already made, and everybody started following a fat-phobic dietary approach. This is the Ancel Keys you may have heard of recently, but now let's meet the Keys of the 1940s, a different one. So in November 1944, Ancel Keys and his team of scientists recruited 36 male subjects who were between 20 and 33 years old. They were to participate in a study that would last for approximately a year. The study would try to mimic the conditions of people affected by the global conflicts of those times. So these subjects were first put on a controlled diet that lasted for 3 months. This was phase 1. The diet aimed for about 3,500 kilocalories and included, as exercise, approximately 20 miles of walking per week. The researchers led by Keys wanted their subjects to lose 25% body weight during this initial phase. It's interesting how they could lose this much while overeating. Anyway, the interesting part follows in the second phase of the experiment. This second phase lasted for 6 months, and the subjects had to follow a semi-starvation diet from February 1945 until July the very same year. Another interesting note is that the semi-starvation protocol included 1,570 kilocalories, or calories. By personal reference, this is nowhere near what I would call a semi-starvation protocol. So, if you're in nutritional ketosis, you wouldn't consider yourself semi-starved by consuming 1,500 or 1,600 kilocalories, provided that you have given enough time to adapt to this metabolic state. Now back to the study. The foods they consumed in this phase were similar to the ones of people who experienced the negative effects of World War II, and they included potatoes, cabbage, sugar, jam, bread, oatmeal, jello, and macaroni. They very rarely consumed minute amounts of dairy and meat, so very small amounts of these food products. The third part of the experiment was the rehabilitation phase, and it lasted for 3 months, between July and October 1945. During this time, the subjects consumed between 2,500 and 3,500 calories, and they were assigned to different intake groups. Some of them consumed more to the lower end, while others consumed more to the upper end of the kcals spectrum. Finally, the last part of the experiment was an uncontrolled rehabilitation phase, I didn't mention it in the slides, where the subjects could consume as much food as they wanted, and some of them went even as high as 10,000 calories per day. Now that's very difficult if you ask me, and it will most likely involve force feeding. But it could also be because of impulsive eating triggered by the fear of hunger from the semi-starvation phase. Now, Keys and colleagues reported that the most dramatic changes they've seen in these subjects were during the semi-starvation phase. As weight went off, their physical aspect degraded. With lower core body temperature, a poor diet, and poor heart rate variability, they lost their sex drive and stamina and became disengaged and disinterested in many aspects of their lives. I suspect this may not have happened had they been put on a low-calorie, well-formulated ketogenic diet, but I may be wrong. They may have not felt hungry at all. Instead, with their strategy, many of the subjects developed obsessive thoughts about food, as you can see in the quote. And they tried substituting foods with consuming enormous amounts of water, excessively chewing gum, excessive consuming coffee and tea, and smoking heavily. Some of them consumed as many as 40 packs of chewing gums, yes, packages, every day. They would chew gum until they felt the last bit of sweetness and flavor and then discharge it. Now, the researchers had to limit chewing gum use to 2 packs a day. Others consumed approximately 15 cups of tea or coffee per day, that is 15. Researchers had to impose additional restrictions. It's interesting that they weren't allowed to use sugar to sweeten their drinks, but they could consume white sugar with their meals. I would say this contributed to their insulin-triggered hunger pangs, and also to their obsessive food thoughts. Anyway, I think they consumed a poor diet altogether. At the beginning of this semi-starvation phase, which is the second phase of the experiment, they could spend time alone whenever they wanted. But as their situation got worse, researchers had them accompanied by someone, a buddy, when attending events outside the research facility. This was to keep them under observation most of the time. Now, I refrain from judging the ethics of this experiment, which is why I don't want to go into too many details about the contents of what they ate. But it seems to me that the purpose of the study deserves more importance and insight. It may be laudable to try to find efficient strategies to help the victims of war. Now, I will only briefly get into the specifics of what they ate because I want to provide some reference for better alternatives. As we can see, their diets seem to focus on refined carbohydrates as the major macronutrient to be consumed. I'd say there's nothing wrong with having your diet focus on carbohydrates, but not refined. So they could have emphasized on the consumption of complex carbs and high fiber foods, but then they wouldn't have mimicked the conditions of war probably. Now, eating bread, jam, macaroni, and plain sugar, I don't know. The control phase of the study reveals that their satisfaction and satiety point with this dietary protocol is somewhere at 3,500 calories. Imagine what these subjects experienced when they were put at 1,500 calories per day during the semi-starvation phase. Now, similarly, I usually consume between 1,400 and 1,700 calories per day with many exceptions and alterations. My diet is very low carb, ketogenic, moderate to low protein. I eat many plant foods and little meat. I consume eggs and some dairy. And I'm never hungry, though I'm in a caloric deficit most of the time. And I've been doing this for more than 2 years at this point. As for these subjects, eating 1570 calories per day with emphasis on refined carbohydrates, this would most likely stimulate their hunger tremendously. Insulin is one of the primary drivers of hunger, along with its interplay with other hunger-regulating factors. These subjects were not efficiently tapping into their adipose tissue. They most likely never entered ketosis, and they may have also catabolized muscle mass as a result. This could explain their significantly low-quality physiologic and psychologic states. Sadly, this experiment is the opposite of what a prolonged fasting experiment would lead to. The subjects of the Minnesota experiment felt much hungrier than an average person would undergo water-only fasting for days at length. In fact, during prolonged fasting, which is more than 48 hours, hunger is the least of problems. Most people don't feel hungry as long as they are in ketosis and as long as they have sufficient body fat to fuel this state. Now, the study ends by saying that it took the subjects a lot of time and force feeding, which is prolonged overconsumption of food, to return their physiology to baseline. Many of them developed lifelong food convictions and habits. I wrote about this study in my book Periodic Fasting as well. Now, if you want to know more about fasting and intermittent fasting as well as experiments similar to this one, you can go check it on my blog. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button below.